She's not coming back. Halverson said it like he was closing a file. No ceremony, no pause. Just the flat administrative certainty of a man who had already moved on before he finished the sentence. Sergeant Willa Crane is gone. We extract now. Nobody argued with him. That was the part that stayed with the people who were there, the part that none of them talked about afterward, not in the debrief, not at the base, not in the careful reconstructed language of the after-action reports. Nobody argued. They just went. Crane heard him say it. She was 14 meters below the ridgeline, half buried in a collapsed irrigation ditch. Her right shoulder dislocated from the impact of the blast, and her radio reduced to a piece of melted polymer that bore no resemblance to functional equipment. The detonation had thrown her backward and down, and the embankment had swallowed her in the way that terrain sometimes swallows soldiers, completely, without ceremony, as if the ground itself had decided to weigh in on the outcome. She could not move her right arm. She could move everything else, and she took inventory the way they had drilled into her at CFB Gagetown during the field survival rotations that most of the men in her cohort had treated as administrative inconvenience, and that Crane had treated like a final exam she could not afford to fail. What do I have? What do I need? What is the first step? She had her rifle. Sling intact, stock cracked at the receiver, action unknown until she tested it. She had her sidearm, a SIG M18, full magazine +1 in the chamber. She had 4 rounds of .338 Lapua left in the detached mag she'd been swapping when the blast hit, and the mag itself was sitting 12 feet up the embankment where she'd dropped it. She had a trauma kit, a signal flare, and approximately 9 hours of darkness left in which to do something with all of it. She did not have a radio. She did not have her team. She did not have any indication that anyone was coming back for her. What she had instead was the memory of Halverson's voice and the very specific shape of the anger that voice had produced in her. Not hot anger, not the kind that made you loud and careless, but the cold, particular anger of a person who has been underestimated so many times that the underestimation has started to feel like a dare. The extraction point was 2 kilometers west. The Kolodny Valley firebase was 1.4 kilometers east. Crane went east. She told herself it was because the mission wasn't finished. The reconnaissance objective, eyes on the mobile signals unit operating out of firebase Kolodny, confirmation of the directional array they'd been tracking for 6 weeks. Relay of coordinates for the electronic warfare package that was supposed to go live at 0600. None of that had happened. Halverson had called the abort before any of it happened, and the abort was now in a vehicle heading west. And the mission was still sitting here in the dark, waiting for someone to pick it up. She told herself it was about the mission because that was the true part, and because the other part, the part about Halverson's voice and the way he'd said Crane, is gone with the same intonation he used for logistical problems, was a part she would examine later, in a context that was not a drainage ditch in the dark, with a dislocated shoulder and 1 functional arm. The shoulder was the immediate problem. She'd dislocated it twice before. Once during a training exercise at Petawawa when she'd taken a bad fall from a rappel line, and once in Kandahar during her first tour, when a vehicle rollover had introduced her right arm to the door frame at a geometry her body had not endorsed. Both times, field reduction. Both times, she'd done it herself, because both times the person nearest to her had looked at the joint, and then looked at her face and said something along the lines of, "We should wait for a medic," which was the kind of advice that revealed more about the advisor than the patient. She found a solid piece of ground at the base of the embankment, braced her back against the packed earth, and spent 40 seconds on the problem. The sound the joint made when it went back was not a sound she would describe to anyone. The sensation was not a sensation she would recommend. She breathed through it in through the nose, out through the mouth for a count of 8. And when she opened her eyes, the shoulder was functional, and the pain had reorganized itself from catastrophic to significant, which was the direction she needed it to go. She retrieved the magazine from the slope. She checked her rifle's action, cycled clean. She did the math one more time. 4 .338 rounds, full SIG magazine, 1 flare, no radio. She started moving. The valley between her position and firebase Kolodny was scrub and frozen ground, the kind of terrain that looked flat on satellite imagery and was in practice a continuous negotiation of shallow gullies and rock shelves that the cold had made treacherous. Crane moved the way she'd been trained to move in terrain like this, using the low points, keeping her profile below the skyline, pausing every 4 minutes to listen to the dark. She'd spent 3 days studying the firebase layout before the mission. Not as a target at the time, as an observation point, a place she needed eyes on from the outside without going in. She knew the northeastern perimeter had a gap in the sensor coverage, where the terrain dropped sharply enough that the motion detection field didn't reach the ground. She knew the vehicle pool was on the western edge adjacent to the generator building. She knew the signals unit, the reason for all of this, was operating from a prefabricated structure on the south side of the compound near the communications array. She also knew that Firebase Kolodny had a complement of approximately 60 personnel, standing guard rotations, and a commanding officer named Breskin, who had a professional reputation for competence that distinguished him from the other Firebase commanders in this sector and made him, by extension, considerably more dangerous. She filed all of it and kept moving. The filing was important. The filing was what separated a plan from a panic. She was 300 meters from the northeastern perimeter when she first heard the patrol. 2 soldiers she assessed from the footfall pattern, moving in a loose, irregular circuit that suggested they'd been on rotation long enough to get comfortable. Comfort was a liability. She'd given a briefing on exactly that topic during a training cycle at Wainwright 18 months ago, a briefing which the colonel presiding had described as technically thorough, while finding several occasions to direct questions to the male sergeant standing beside her, as though information might be distributed by proximity rather than source. She waited the patrol out from behind a rock shelf, flat and motionless for 11 minutes, until the pattern had completed enough cycles for her to identify the longest gap. 47 seconds between the western turn and the northeastern corner. She needed 12. She crossed in 8. Inside the perimeter, she spent 4 minutes in the shadow of the sensor housing, listening to the compound resolve itself into its component sounds. Generator hum from the west, voices from the central barracks building, muffled, the sound of men indoors and not paying attention to the outside. A single set of boots doing a circuit of the vehicle pool, irregular cadence, half-hearted. The compound felt like a place that had decided nothing was coming. That was the second mistake Breskin's garrison had made tonight. The first had been operating on the assumption that a woman in a ditch with a blown radio was a solved problem. She moved through the compound the way water finds the lowest path, not toward any single destination, but following the negative space, the gaps between attention, the 17 feet of shadow between the generator housing and the first prefab structure, the blind corner on the eastern side of the barracks. The 40-meter stretch of open ground she covered during a shift change when both sets of eyes were oriented toward each other rather than the perimeter. The signals building was exactly where the imagery had placed it. The directional array was clearly visible on the exterior, the large dish angled east-northeast, which confirmed the targeting data they'd been working from. Through the narrow window in the south wall, she could see 2 operators at the equipment bank and a third figure standing over a laptop at the far end of the room. This was the confirmation they needed. This was what the 6-week collection effort had been building toward. Crane had no way to transmit it. She stood in the 12 inches of shadow beside the signals building window and did the math. The electronic warfare package was scheduled to go live at 0600. Without her relay, without the coordinates confirmation, it would not deploy. And without the EW package, the signals unit in that building would continue operating, which meant the network it was feeding would continue operating, which meant the 6 weeks of collection would remain exactly what it currently was, incomplete. She needed to get inside that building and use their equipment to make the transmission herself. The door was on the northern face, facing the interior of the compound. 1 guard post visible from her angle, approximately 20 meters from the door, facing inward, not facing her. She had 4.338 rounds and a full SIG magazine and a dislocated shoulder she'd put back in herself 40 minutes ago. And she was about to walk into an enemy communications facility and use the furniture to save a 6-week intelligence operation that her commanding officer had abandoned. Crane had always done her best work when the math looked impossible. She'd noticed this about herself early in her career and had never been entirely sure whether to file it under asset or liability. She went in through the door low and fast, the way her close quarters instructor at St. Jean had drilled into the cohort during the 3rd week of training, when they were tired enough that muscle memory was all that was left. The guard nearest the door registered a presence and was already turning. When Crane covered the distance between them, with a kind of efficiency that has nothing to do with size and everything to do with geometry and timing. He went down without making the sound he'd been preparing to make. The first operator at the equipment bank heard the movement and rose from his chair. Crane crossed the room in 3 steps and did what needed to be done, clean and deliberate, the same way she did everything that needed to be done, without elaboration and without apology. The second operator made the calculation that the first had not and raised both hands before she reached him. She looked at the third figure at the laptop. He was a technician by the look of his uniform insignia, mid-40s, with the specific stillness of someone who has decided that absolute non-movement is the best available option. He was making the right decision. "English," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Some," he said. She crossed to the equipment bank and began working. She knew the hardware class from a familiarization course she'd done at CFC Kingston 18 months ago. Cross-reference training for signals intelligence operations that she'd requested 3 times before it was approved, each time having the request queried with a version of the question, "Are you sure this is the track you want?" "Yes," she had said, each time. She was sure. The coalition frequency was there. The signal strength was marginal but transmittable. She keyed the radio and began giving coordinates, call sign Greystone, firebase location, and confirmation of the directional array, everything the EW package needed to execute on schedule. The duty officer on the other end asked for authentication. She gave it. He asked for her team's status. She said she was the team and kept transmitting. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the generator hum and the breathing of the technician against the far wall. "You transmitted our location," he said. His English was better than he'd suggested. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "They told us the coalition element had extracted." "They were wrong," she said. Another pause. The technician's hands were flat on the laptop case. He was not reaching for anything. He had read the room accurately and was making intelligent decisions, which she noted and respected. "You are one soldier," he said. "Yes, they left you here." She didn't answer that one. She was already moving back toward the equipment, checking whether the transmission had gone through clean, whether the EW package would have what it needed. "Why are you still doing this?" he said. "They left you." She looked up from the equipment. "Because the mission doesn't stop being the mission. Because someone decided to leave," she said. "The objective is still the objective. The people who need this information still need it. That doesn't change based on whether my team is standing behind me." She pulled the portable transmitter from the secondary rack, the small handheld unit that would let her continue communicating from outside the building. "Old habit. You always secured your communications before you moved, because moving without communications was how soldiers became statistics. Don't follow me," she said to the technician, "and don't touch that equipment for the next 40 minutes. He looked at her steadily. "You are going to the command building." She didn't confirm or deny. "Where the commander is," he said. "Breskin." She went out the north door. The problem with Breskin was that he was good at his job. She knew this from the 6 weeks of collection data, from the pattern of his operations, from the specific absence of exploitable mistakes that characterized his firebase's activity compared to the others in the sector. Good commanders were more dangerous than bad commanders, for the obvious reason and for a less obvious one. Good commanders tended to produce better disciplined soldiers, which meant the garrison she was moving through was more alert than the average, which meant the gap between manageable and catastrophic was narrower. She was 60 meters from the command building when the compound alarm activated. Not a soft alert, the full klaxon, every light on the exterior of every structure, the particular organized chaos of a garrison, going from quiet to combat posture in the space of 6 seconds. She dropped flat and pressed herself against the ground and held completely still. This was the moment where training separated from instinct. The instinct was to run. The training was to stay motionless for 10 seconds and listen to where the response was organizing itself. She stayed motionless and listened. The signals building was drawing the initial response, which made sense. That was the most recent location of evidence. She had maybe 3 minutes before the search expanded. She moved, fast and low, across the lit ground between her position and the command building's east wall, using the shadow of the vehicle on her left as cover for the first 15 meters and the particular geometry of the klaxon lights, which created a rotating bright spot that also created a rotating blind spot. For the last 10, she reached the east wall and pressed flat against it. The command building had 2 exterior access points, A main entrance on the north face and a secondary door on the eastern wall that the satellite imagery had shown was used for vehicle access to the adjacent covered bay. She could hear two guards at the main entrance, voices elevated because of the alarm, radio traffic they were trying to sort through. The secondary door had a padlock. She'd trained on Russian military hardware twice. She was through it in 90 seconds. Inside, the command building was a central corridor with an operations room at the far end and 4 individual offices along the west wall. She moved to the operations room because she needed to see the full picture before she moved on the man who had drawn it. Breskin would be in his office or in the operations room, and either location told her something different about how he was managing the situation. He was in the operations room. She registered 3 things simultaneously: a large tactical map on the wall table, 2 junior officers standing over it, and Breskin himself standing by the communications terminal on the far wall, a compact man in his early 50s with the kind of face that had been organized by years of making decisions under pressure into something that looked less like a face and more like a position. He turned when she came through the door, and he did not make the mistake of reaching for the sidearm at his hip. He was too good for that mistake. He read the room in the same instant she had, and he arrived at the same conclusion. At this distance and this angle, reaching for a weapon was a process, not an outcome, and she was already past the threshold where the process mattered. The 2 junior officers had gone very still. She noted this and put it in the appropriate column. "English," she said. Breskin looked at her. "Fluent," he said. His voice was level. There was no performance in it. He was not performing calm. He was calm, the kind of calm that comes from a career of understanding that panic is a choice. She crossed to the map table in 3 steps and read the operational overlay. Her Russian was limited, but military cartography had a grammar that crossed languages, grid references, unit markers, timing notations. She found what she was looking for in 40 seconds. The EW package was supposed to neutralize the signals array at 0600. On the map overlay, there was a second notation she hadn't anticipated, a scheduled transmission at 0530, 30 minutes before the EW package would execute. A burst transmission, the kind that delivered a compressed data packet in under a second, the kind that was nearly impossible to intercept or block. If that transmission went out, it didn't matter what the EW package did at 0600. The data would already be wherever it was going. 22 minutes until 0530. She looked at Breskin. "There's a burst transmission scheduled for 0530, she said, "from this facility." He met her eyes and said nothing. "The data packet," she said. "What's in it? Still nothing?" He was too disciplined for the involuntary. Tells that less experienced men produced under this kind of pressure. She couldn't read confirmation or denial in his face. She could only read the decision to say nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. She went back to the communications terminal. If she could interrupt the burst transmission, if she could corrupt the scheduled packet before it's sent, she could preserve the EW package's effectiveness. She had 21 minutes, and she knew the hardware class, and she had the portable transmitter she'd pulled from the signals building. The 2 junior officers had not moved. She was aware of them, the way she was always aware of the things she was not directly looking at, peripherally, continuously, with the specific low-grade attention that her instructors had called tactical awareness, and that she had always thought of as simply paying attention to the whole room. The one on the left was watching her hands. The one on the right was watching Breskin. Breskin was watching her. She worked. The terminal's interface was familiar enough from the familiarization course that she could navigate it with confidence, not expertise but competence, which was what she had and what she needed. She found the scheduled transmission in the queue. She began working on the packet structure. "You train on this equipment," Breskin said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said without looking up. "Where?" "CFC Kingston," she said. 18 months ago. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you requested that training yourself." She glanced at him. "Yes." Another pause. The alarm outside was still sounding, but she could hear the response reorganizing itself, the initial surge settling into something more systematic, which meant they were shifting from react to search, which meant she had less time than the original 3-minute estimate. "Your team extracted," Breskin said. "Yes. And you stayed." "I didn't stay," she said. "I was in a ditch." There's a difference. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not respect exactly. More the acknowledgement that he was in the presence of a category of problem he had not planned for. She had seen that expression before. She had been producing it in the faces of commanding officers for 9 years. She found the transmission queue and began the process of corrupting the packet. It was not a simple process. The packet was encrypted, and the encryption was layered in a way that meant she couldn't simply delete the content. She had to introduce errors at the structural level that would cause the packet to fail verification on the receiving end. She was doing something she had never done operationally, using knowledge from a course she'd taken on her own initiative after being told 3 times the track wasn't really her area. 14 minutes. The junior officer on the right moved. Not toward her, toward the door, a single step, the beginning of a decision that had not yet committed to itself. She said, "Don't," without looking at him, and the step stopped. She heard him breathing, the particular compressed breathing of someone who has just been told their next choice is significant. Breskin said something to him in Russian. The junior officer went back to his position. She looked at Breskin briefly. "Thank you." He said nothing. She went back to work. She was 11 minutes in when the door came off its hinges. Not metaphorically. The secondary door she'd come through simply detached from the frame on one side as 2 soldiers hit it simultaneously from the outside, and the room went from quiet to extremely loud in a period shorter than a sentence. She was already moving when the door came down. The portable transmitter was in her left hand because she had put it there 6 minutes ago when she'd finished with the burst packet, and the next thing she needed was a clear channel to Coalition Command. She cleared the operations table on the right side, putting the map between herself and the entrance. And she was behind the communications terminal before the first soldier through the door had identified which specific part of the room she'd been standing in. Breskin said something sharp. She caught the word stop and not much else, but the response to his voice was immediate. The soldiers who'd come through the door held their positions, which told her something important about the relationship between this commander and his garrison. She stood up from behind the terminal. There were 4 of them, 4 soldiers, weapons up in a doorway, and Breskin standing between them and her, with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had not yet decided what the next sentence was going to be. She understood then that he was deciding. He had the room, he had the soldiers, he had the authority to end this in 4 seconds, and he had not done it, and he had not done it because he was deciding something. She had a theory about what that something was. The burst transmission, she said. "I corrupted the packet. It won't send clean at 0530. The receiving end will reject it." She looked at him steadily. "The EW package executes at 0600. Your signals array will be offline within minutes of that." Breskin looked at her for a long moment. "You came in here alone," he said, with a dislocated shoulder. She said nothing. "I can see how you're favoring it," he said, "Nud. The left side, I reset it in the field." He looked at his 4 soldiers. Then he looked back at her. "What do you want, Sergeant?" She had been waiting for that question. That question was the pivot. That question was the moment where a man who had been holding all the authority in the room acknowledged, even temporarily, that authority and outcome were not the same thing. She told him what she wanted, a written confirmation in his hand of the signals unit's operational parameters and the network contacts it had been servicing for the past 8 weeks. A secondary confirmation of the burst transmission's destination, both documents signed. And in exchange, she said, the EW package executes at 0600 with no interference from your garrison, and you walk out through whatever door you prefer when this is over. He looked at her for a very long time, long enough that the soldiers in the doorway shifted their weight, long enough that she was aware of the seconds passing in a way that felt physical. "You know what this facility has been doing," he said. "The transmission, the network." She said, "I know enough. And the documents I sign will give your intelligence people the rest." "Yes." Another long pause. She had stopped trying to read his face and had started reading his hands instead. The way the fingers were positioned, whether they were moving. They weren't moving. That was useful information. "You are not what I was expecting tonight," he said. "Nobody is," she said. "Make a decision." He turned to the soldiers in the doorway. He said something in Russian that was too rapid and idiomatic for her to parse. But she could parse the response, which was the soldiers lowering their weapons and stepping back from the door. She filed that as provisional. He crossed to the map table. He pulled a field notebook from his breast pocket. He wrote for 4 minutes while she stood and watched and kept one eye on the doorway and the other on the room. He was a precise writer. The documents were clear and organized and complete in a way that told her he'd decided not to do this halfway. He slid both pages across the table. She picked them up. She read them. Both completely. She was not the kind of person who accepted documents without reading them. The destination of the burst transmission was a contact designation she didn't recognize. She photographed it with the portable transmitter's secondary function because the transmitter had a camera mode that she had specifically selected this model for during her equipment requisition 8 months ago, a selection that the procurement officer had queried 3 separate times because it was 11% over the standard allocation. She clipped the transmitter back to her kit. She looked at Breskin. "The door," she said. He gestured toward the secondary entrance. She went. Outside, the compound was still in partial alert, but the search pattern had moved to the eastern perimeter, away from her. She crossed the open ground between the command building and the fence line in the blind spot she'd identified on entry and went through the perimeter the same way she'd come in. She was 300 meters out when the EW package executed. At 0600 precise, the compound went dark behind her. Lights out, generator offline. The directional array on the signals building, pivoting uselessly as its control interface lost power. The silence that replaced the generator hum was the particular silence of a facility that had just been told it was done. She kept moving. The coalition extraction point was 2 kilometers west of the firebase. She made it in 40 minutes on terrain that had no business being covered. In 40 minutes by a person with a recently dislocated shoulder and 4 hours of accumulated field damage. She made it because she counted every step, and the counting kept her from thinking about the things she would think about later, in a hospital bed with time and the particular silence of a room where nothing was actively trying to kill her. The flare brought the helicopter. It always did. The medic who came off the bird was Corporal Nwachukwu, a compact-focused woman who had the specific efficiency of a person who had seen too much to waste time on preamble. She put her hands on Crane's shoulder before she said a word, and her face produced the expression that shoulders in this condition reliably produce in medics. "I know," Crane said. "Sergeant, I need you too." "I know," she said. "Get me on the bird." Nwachukwu looked at her face. She did the calculation. She got her on the bird. The field hospital at FOB Arcadia was awake when they arrived, which told her someone had transmitted ahead, which told her the duty officer had understood what she'd sent and had acted on it. She filed that as a positive development and lost some time after that in the specific dim space between consciousness and sedation, where things happen around you without fully connecting to you. She woke up at 11:40 hours. She knew because she looked for a clock immediately. Second thing she did was try to sit up. The shoulder had been immobilized, and her body had taken extensive inventory of the past several hours and presented the bill. Colonel Adaze Nnamdi was sitting in a chair 2 feet from the bed. She was the base commander for Joint Special Operations at FOB Arcadia, a tall, composed woman with the economy of movement of someone who had made peace long ago with the weight of the decisions she carried. She was holding a coffee that had clearly been there long enough to be cold. "Sergeant Crane," she said. "Ma'am," Crane said. Nnamdi set the coffee down. "I've been reading your personnel file for the past 3 hours," she said. "I want you to know that because I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you comes from someone who has read the full record, not a summary." Crane waited. "The burst transmission," Nnamdi said, "the corrupted packet. Our signals intelligence team worked it for 6 hours after the EW package executed. The destination contact that you photographed is a clear designation we have been trying to identify for 7 months. We knew the designation existed. We did not know where it sat in the network or who was servicing it. The documents Breskin signed are currently being worked by 4 analysts and 2 senior intelligence officers who used the word significant 3 times in the last 40 minutes. She paused. "You walked into a foreign military firebase with a dislocated shoulder and 3 hours of darkness left, and you came out with the intelligence product that 7 months of collection hadn't produced." Crane looked at the ceiling. The shoulder was making itself felt in a comprehensive way. "The EW package," she said. "It executed on schedule. Yes. Your coordinates relay was clean. The signals unit is offline. Confirmed. The array is non-functional and the personnel have been extracted from the firebase. We have custody of 4 of them, including the 2 operators you encountered." Crane processed that. Then, Breskin. Nnamdi's expression shifted, not quite a pause, more a careful arrangement. Breskin departed the firebase prior to the EW execution. He is not currently in custody. She looked at the colonel. "He's not a priority," Nnamdi said. "Not compared to what those documents gave us. He'll surface through the network eventually, and when he does, The picture you put together tonight will be the reason we recognize him." Crane looked back at the ceiling. She was thinking about the moment in the operations room when Breskin had said something to his soldiers and they had lowered their weapons. The thing she'd been trying to understand since it happened. "He helped you," Nanamdi said. "We know. The garrison logs support it. He didn't interfere with your extraction." She said nothing. "We have a working theory about why," Nanamdi said. "The network the signals unit was servicing, the contacts in those documents, there's a designation in there that our analysts believe Breskin has been trying to surface through other means for some time. He may have had his own reasons for wanting those documents to reach us." Crane absorbed that. She thought about a man standing between his soldiers and the target they were supposed to take down, making a decision, making it slowly and completely. "Do you know why you haven't been given team leadership?" Nanamdi said. The question came without preamble. Crane looked at her. "I have a theory," she said. Nanamdi held her gaze. "Halverson's after-action report was filed at ZO 700 this morning. He reported you killed in action. He reported that extraction conditions made physical confirmation impossible, and that the decision to extract without verifying your status was within his command authority. He also reported the mission failed. He did not know you'd completed the objective. He did not know about the burst transmission or the documents or the coordinates relay. He filed a failed mission report while you were walking through a foreign firebase with a dislocated shoulder." The room was quiet. Crane thought about Halverson's voice on the ridge. "She is not coming back." The administrative finality of it. Not grief, not hesitation. The voice of a man who had converted the problem into a past tense and moved on. "There is going to be an investigation," Nanamdi said. "It's not optional. Halverson's report contradicts physical evidence, and his own team's subsequent statements are inconsistent. The investigation will address the extraction decision and the KIA filing." Crane said nothing. "There is also this," Nanamdi said. She produced a single sheet of paper and set it on the tray table beside the bed. Crane read it. It was a personnel action, effective immediately, sergeant to staff accelerated citation for exceptional operational conduct. Attached was a second document, a unit designation. Task Force Greystone. She read that twice. 6 billets, Nanamdi said. 1 team lead. Your name is in the team lead position. Mission profile is signals intelligence and direct action against the network identified in Breskin documents. You built the intelligence foundation for this operation. I want you to finish it. Outside the hospital window, the base was awake and ordinary. She could hear a vehicle engine, voices from somewhere down the corridor, the everyday texture of a place that did not know how close the night had come to being something it couldn't recover from. She thought about Halverson's voice. She thought about the ditch and the inventory and the particular cold arithmetic of 4 rounds and a dislocated shoulder and a firebase she had no business walking into and walked into anyway. She thought about the 47-second window in the patrol rotation that she'd exploited in 8. She thought about Breskin writing in his field notebook with the careful precision of a man who had decided to do something completely and do it right. She thought about Nwachukwu's hands on her shoulder in the dark. She thought about 7 months of collection and 4 analysts using the word significant and what it meant that 1 soldier in a drainage ditch had done what 7 months hadn't. Yes, she said. She said it the way she made every decision that actually mattered, without performance, without qualification, just the flat, direct monosyllable of a person who had already done the calculation and was ready to move to the next problem. Nanamdi nodded. She stood. 8 weeks for medical clearance, she said. Your surgeon projects full mobility. In the meantime, personnel files for the available roster will be in your system by 1800 today. Take whoever you need. She picked up her cold coffee and walked to the door. One more thing, she said, not turning around. Halverson's report listed this as a failed mission. She paused. I have already submitted the corrected classification to Theater Command. The mission is a success with full intelligence capture and objective completion. Your call sign is on the report. She left. Crane lay in the hospital bed and looked at the personnel action on the tray table and the unit designation below her name. Task Force Greystone. The same call sign she'd given the duty officer in the dark from a signals building she had no authorization to be inside, transmitting coordinates for an EW package that executed on schedule and did exactly what it was supposed to do. She had known, when she went east instead of west, that she was making a decision she couldn't unmake. She had known that there was no version of that choice that came without consequences, some of which she would be living with for a long time, in the specific way that soldiers live with the decisions they made in the dark when no one was watching, and the math looked impossible. She had made it anyway, not for Halverson, not for the team that had crunched away up the ridge without looking back, for the mission, because the mission was still the mission, and for the 38 personnel in the coalition forward. Element 2 kilometers south of firebase Kolodny, who had gone to sleep that night without knowing how close the morning had come to being a different kind of morning entirely. They were awake now. They were drinking coffee and complaining about the cold and doing all the ordinary things that people do when they are alive and don't know how recently that stopped being guaranteed. She reached for the personnel roster file on the tablet beside the bed and opened it. 8 weeks, 6 billets to fill, a network with 7 active nodes remaining, and documents in the hands of 4 analysts that would tell Task Force Greystone exactly where to start. Staff Sergeant Willa Crane, call sign Greystone, had been left for dead in a ditch. She was just getting started.